Let's start off with this topic, social identity and gender. Social identity and gender comes under the topic social identity and change. That happens to be topic 1.3. And we have seen enough of questions to know that this is the most popular topic in terms of paper one. Now, when we talk about social identity and change, it is pretty important that we understand the difference between the terms social identity and self identity, where self identity is the perception an individual holds about himself or herself. Whereas when we use the term social identity has to do with the societal perception. For instance, if you are a male, the way you see yourself is your male identity. I'm sorry, is your self identity, right? However, at the same time, how a society sees a male and the expectations that the society has from a male would be seen as a social identity. Now, the topic over here is social identity and gender. There are a couple of questions that we've had on this particular subject matter that I would like to discuss towards the end. And yeah, let's begin. Now, when we talk about social identity and gender, it is pretty important that we understand the difference between the terms sex and gender. When we use the word sex, sex refers to the biological characteristics that define or determine humans, that categorize humans as either male or female. When you talk about the word sex has to do with is determined through your chromosomes. The word sex has to do with your hormones and your reproductive anatomy. However, when we use the word gender, gender is a socially constructed phenomenon, right? As we use the term gender, gender has to do with your socially constructed roles, with the expectations the society has from you, with the expectations the society has from you in terms of behavior, in terms of how you are to act according to your particular sex, right? Now, your gender is influenced by your culture, your gender is influenced by your upbringing, your gender is also influenced by your personal identity. Now, when we talk about gender again, differences in gender could be seen or determined, could be witnessed through the differences in terms of how we are attired, maybe the our clothing. Taking this a little further, and before that, a one line distinction between the word sex and gender. Sex is the biological difference between males and females. However, when we use the word gender, gender has to do with the difference in terms of societal expectations, according to which you differentiate yourself as being a male or a female. Now, to begin with, we would discuss the the typical characteristics or the typical differences in terms of gender between males and females. Now, if we talk about males over here, a quick little thing that I'm sure every one of you would be familiar with, and the basic distinctions between males and females, which everyone sitting over here would be aware of. But just to brush them up, just to remind you of what we come across very often in our societies. Now, if we talk about the distinction of the different identities between if we talk about the distinction between male identities and female identities, about males, that is men, men tend to make up the wealthy minority of society, right? The wealthy minority of society. Why, when I use the word minority, I'm talking about demography. If you talk about demographic statistics, global statistics, rather, you'd see our societies, our world has more of females as compared to males. So when you talk about men being a minority, that makes a lot of sense. However, when you talk about when being a wealthy minority, what we actually mean is, despite of the fact that men are in a minority, it is pretty crucial, it's pretty important that we understand that they are they're the ones who are the most affluent. They're the ones who are the most wealthy. Now, with wealth comes power, right? With wealth comes power. And what sort of power are we talking about? We're talking about political power. We're talking about religious power. We're talking about power in terms of military and cultural powers. Now, about political powers, you'd see all the top-notch political positions are held by males. The religious top-notch positions are held by males. So is the case with military and cultural powers. You see, even in our part of the world, even if you talk about Pakistan, you see how culturally males are expected, or males are seen to be the head of households more often as compared to females. The third point over here, we all are aware, like I mentioned a minute earlier, this happens to stand true more for our part of the world. Males get more of opportunities when it comes to education. Not only do males get more of opportunities when it comes to education, but these opportunities lead to males having better chances when it comes to getting jobs. They get better jobs, because of which they stand better chances of expecting or getting or experiencing higher social mobility. Now, what do I mean when I use the word social mobility? Social mobility is moving up or down the social scale. Social mobility is moving up or down the social scale. In other words, you being poor today, and eventually you climbing up the social ladder, the social class ladder, and you eventually end up being rich, right? So the movement up or down the social scale is referred to as social mobility. And of course, when you're talking about social mobility over here, we're talking about upward social mobility. So the point I was trying to make over here is males have better chances when it comes to getting education, which consequently leads to them getting better jobs and experiencing higher upward social mobility. The next thing, men tend to be paid more than women even for similar jobs. The next thing, which we're all aware of, men tend to benefit through patrilineal inheritance. Now, patrilineal inheritance. Now, for instance, if whenever we use the word patrilineal has to do with how you receive more from your parents. I mean, it could be in terms of titles. Now, most of you, your second name is your father's name, so that has to do with patrilineal inheritance. It could be in terms of the titles you carry. It could be in terms of your wealth. It could be in terms of your property inheritance as well. The next point, men tend to expect from women to be confined to domestic sphere. Now, this again stands to be true more in some parts of the world as compared to others. Now, if you talk about South Asian countries like Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, you see how males expect females to be confined to domestic sphere, or to stay at home and deal with all the household affairs, to deal with all the domestic affairs. The next point, men tend to get away with sexual violence against women in many societies. Unfortunately, sexual assault, sexual violence, men tend to get away with them more conveniently. More conveniently, if you talk about country like ours, if you talk about like I very conveniently give examples of Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. You've seen how in many parts of our country, in more so in the rural parts of our country, you've seen how men very conveniently get away, or they do not get punished for the sexual assaults that they commit. The next one, men tend to make laws that apply social controls to the activities of women. Now, these laws could be either they could be written laws, or they could be unwritten, or rather say unstated laws that apply more of control over the activities of women. In other words, what we're talking about is men getting to define how women would live their lives. The next point, again, men tend to use violence and even kill a female relative if a woman is deemed to have brought shame to the family. Now, in our country, again, you've seen there are a lot of murders that take place in the name of honor killing, right? So if a female is apparently, allegedly, bought to have a shame to the family, or has done something that does not go in line with the family rules and regulations, many individuals, many females, they end up losing their lives over this. Now, this doesn't at all mean the murders they take place, the murders that men tend to commit, they are justified. They're of course not justified at all. Now, taking this a little further, let's talk about this sociological reference over here. That was the sociological reference over here of this Australian sociologist with the name Connell. If we talk about this Australian sociologist, she claims that many cultures believe that the behavior of both men and women, many cultures believe that the behavior of both men and women should conform to the hegemonic or dominant set of ideas. Now, what does the word hegemonic in this context mean? When I use the word hegemonic over here, we're talking about the widely accepted ideas about being a male or females. We're not talking about what's right, what's wrong. We're not, I mean, as a sociology student, you should have this in your mind. You should acknowledge this, that what might be right for some might not be right for another. What might be a norm for some might not be a norm for another. What might be a deviant act for some might not be a deviant act for another. So, according to Connell, in many parts of the world, like this says, in many cultures, there's a belief that is held that the behavior of men and women should conform to the dominant set of ideas, or to the widely accepted set of ideas, or to the hegemonic set of ideas that constitute what is referred to as masculine and feminine identity. In other words, our societies define how males are expected to behave. Our societies define how females are expected to behave. And these rules and regulations, like I mentioned earlier, in many cases, they're not even written. In many cases, they're not even stated anywhere, right? In many cases, no one explicitly clarifies them. No one talks about them. In many cases, we see topics of such nature being seen as a taboo. Nonetheless, if anyone is not able to live their lives, if anyone is not able to behave how the society expects them to behave, being being a male or a female, they might be interpreted as a deviant individual. Now, for this, we need to understand what the word deviant over here means. The word deviant refers to the deviant is the word deviant is the opposite of the word norm. When I use the word deviant, an act, or in this case, an individual, right? An act that is not acceptable at a particular time, place, and situation. So, what you are, if you're not able to live your lives according to the gender that has been prescribed to you, you might be seen as a deviant, or your acts or your behavior might not be seen as acceptable in a particular society. Taking this ahead, let's move on and talk about feminine identity. So we'd now discuss feminine identities, and we talk about a comparison between how female identities were like back in the 19th and the 20th century, and how this is different from the female identities that is talked about, or that is witnessed today in the 21st century. Bear this thing in mind. You, being a sociology student, should be aware that we when we talk about these differences, when we talk about these changes might be witnessed, or these changes might be seen to be more evident in some parts of the world than others. You are also expected to understand and to remind yourselves that there are cultural differences, there are social differences, there are differences in terms of customs, traditions, because of which these changes in feminine identities that I would be talking about are witnessed, are explicitly seen in some parts of the world and not others. Even if you talk about our country, you've seen how there's a huge difference between how a feminine identity is like in a rural part of our country as compared to the urban and the more advanced and metropolitan cities, even in our country. Now, taking this ahead, we're talking about a comparison. We're talking about a comparison between how female identity was like back in the 20th century as compared to how it is like today in the 21st century. Now, during the 20th century, female children through gender role socialization. Now, what does the word gender role socialization over here mean? When you use the word gender role socialization, you're talking about individuals, a male or a female child, being socialized according to his or her gender. We're talking about how a child's upbringing process is different according to the gender. For instance, we're talking about the clear-cut distinctions between you being a male and you being a female, and you being told what the society expects from you, what the society expects of you, being a male or a female. So during the 20th century, female children, through gender role socialization, they were taught to take on a feminine identity. Now, we're talking about a feminine identity that has been defined. We're talking about a feminine identity that has been defined by males, right? Now, during the 20th century, female children through gender role socialization were taught to take on a feminine identity that reflected hegemonic. Hegemonic, that is the male dominated definitions of femininity. In other words, we talking about femininity being defined by men. Now, how is it that femininity could be defined by males? Because remember, in the previous slide, we spoke about how males are more powerful. They're more powerful politically, religiously, culturally. They're more powerful within societies, despite of the fact that they demographically are a tiny minority. So hegemonic, that is male dominated definitions of femininity. Example, females were expected to consider themselves to have a subordinate identity compared to males. Now, despite of the fact that males are less in number, they're expected to play a subordinative role. They're expected to be considered as a subordinate, or I don't know if the word inferior makes a lot of sense over here, but that's something that I can recall of right now. Now, talking about how this has changed and how this has changed today in this 21st century. Today, as I speak, as I typically put it, the first quarter of the 21st century is coming to an end today. So during 21st century, right, we're talking about a comparison here, right? We're talking about a comparison about how there's been a difference in terms of feminine identities back in the 19th and 20th century compared to how things are like today in the contemporary era. So when we talk about as we talk about the 20th century, today we see that there have been signs. We see signs that the patriarchal versions of femininity have been challenged. There have been signs that the patriarchal versions of femininity have been challenged. Now, what does the word patriarchy over here mean? Patriarchy means male domination. We're talking about the male dominating. We're talking about the versions of femininity, like I said, that have been defined that have been defined by men. So during the 21st century, there have been signs of the patriarchal versions of femininity being challenged as societies have modernized. Now, over the last, let's just say 50, 80 years, 100 years, around 100 years over the last century, we've seen how our societies have evolved more so as compared to the past, right? So the changes our societies have witnessed today have been at a faster pace as compared to the past. As we talk about these changes, we've seen societies modernizing. There have been changes in terms of the economic structures. There have been changes in terms of workforce requirements. For instance, if I talk about these changes a little more, we've seen how today there are more of females that are a part of the workforce as compared to the past. Now, there could be many reasons behind this. Amongst these reasons, number one, an increase in the service industry and an increase in the tertiary industry. Today, you've seen a lot of a lot of development in terms of banking, in terms of insurance, in terms of teaching, in terms of medicine, in terms of engineering, and the list goes on. Now, these are jobs that do not require a lot of physical strength, right? So biologically, we've seen, or we're aware that men are stronger as compared to women, right? Biologically, men hold more strength. They hold more strength as compared to females. But then again, if because of the changes our societies have witnessed, today we do not even need people with a lot of strength. Then an increase in the service and the tertiary sector, an increase in automation. And I mean, today we are in the age where people talk about artificial intelligence, right? So the increase in automation, the increase in, I mean, the technological development our societies have witnessed, this has led to the patriarchal versions of femininity being challenged. In other words, females today might not show acceptance towards their gender identity being defined by men, right? Taking it a little further, if we talk about Sharp and Wilkinson, Sue Sharp and Wilkinson, they claim that women today experience greater educational opportunities. And remember, the more educational opportunities you receive, the better chances you hold of employment. The better chances you hold of employment results in the better chances you have of being economically independent, the chances you have of being economically more powerful as compared to the past. So let's go step by step. We spoke about how today in this 21st century there's been a change witness, a change in terms of how the patriarchal versions of femininity being challenged. We've spoken about how, according to Sharp and Wilkinson, there's been a difference in terms of how in terms of the opportunities that females had back in the past compared to the opportunities females have today. And these educational opportunities, these employment opportunities have consequently led to females feeling more economically independent, females feeling more economically powerful. Now, taking it ahead, according to Walter et al., that is Walter and others, today there's been a gradual acquisition of greater opportunity. Today there's been a gradual acquisition of greater opportunity and economic power. Today, females are seen to be having more of opportunities than they ever did, because of which we see them being economically more powerful. And this has led to how the attitude that girls and women used to carry has changed. And if you talk about the reasons behind this, or if you talk about rather say examples to support this, we've seen young girls today having role models, having female role models. They are aspiring professional careers. They're more inclined towards a career. They're more inclined. They have better plans when it comes to a professional career ahead. They're more career oriented as compared to females who were like back in the past. This can also be witnessed through the acquisition of a range of different rights. And amongst these rights, we could talk about how females today get the right to initiate a divorce, which back in the past was nothing, which back in the past was something no one could even think of, right? Even if I talk about the more developed parts of the world, right? More so today, in many parts of the world, females have received reproductive rights. They have the right to conceive or not, right? Now, all of this and a lot more to it. I mean, this is something that we could go on and on and on for hours. This has consequently led to females abandoning hegemonic or patriarchal definitions of feminine identity. So, because of these changes, amongst others, we've seen how females today are wanting to abandon, where females today are wanting to let go of the hegemonic patriarchal definitions of feminine identity, right? The hegemonic patriarchal definitions of feminine identity, or in other words, the more widely accepted definitions of feminine identity today, females are showing readiness towards letting go of them, right? One. Number two, globally we've seen there's been a difference. Of course, when I use the word globally, there are these differences could be witnessed more in some parts of the world as compared to others, but we've seen by and large how there has been an active resistance towards sexism and active resistance towards misogyny. Now, when we use the word sexism over here, when we use the word sexism and misogyny over here, they're of course related concepts. However, as we use the word sexism has more to do with the discrimination, the prejudice, or the stereotyping based on either sex or gender, right? So when you are being discriminated merely on the basis of your gender or merely on the basis of your sex, we use the word sexism for that. However, when we use the word misogyny has more to do with the hatred and the hostility men show or the society show towards females. Like I said, these are relatable concepts. Nonetheless, it is important, of course, because we're here to learn something new. It is important that we understand the differences amongst them too. And however, at the same time, it is additionally also important that we recognize that they are both related to the same concept. Now, taking this a little further from here, and if we talk about the word, and if we talk about masculine identities, see, understand what we're doing. We are discussing, we're studying this topic, social identity and gender. This topic, social identity and gender, comes under the heading of, or is a subtopic rather, to the main topic, that is topic 1.3, social identity and change. As we're talking about social identity and gender, initially I started off with the distinction between the term self-identity and social identity. I went on to discuss the distinction between the term sex and gender, and then I tried reminding you all, which, if you guys recall, I had said these are some points that you guys all have at the back of your mind. I just wanted to remind you of these points about the differences that males and females tend to experience within societies, more so globally. Then we went on and we spoke about the difference between feminine identities or female identities, the differences that females feel today if you compare them as compared to the past. We spoke about a comparison between female experiences. We spoke about a comparison between feminine identity back in the 19th and 20th century with how things are like today in this contemporary society. Now, moving on, let's try doing the same for masculine identities or male identities. As we refer to masculine identities over here, let me introduce you all to this gentleman with the name Meshuggah. And if we speak about Meshuggah, he was, I mean, have a look at this, have a look at where this individual used to teach. This is a little about him and his profile. Let's take this a little ahead. According to Meshuggah, hegemonic masculine values, right? Remember, we're using the word hegemonic over here. Hegemonic, the term over here in this context refers to the widely accepted ideas of masculine value system. Hegemonic masculine value system stresses on a particular set of masculine goals. Now, we're talking about how masculine or a traditional or a widely accepted or a dominating or the more popular masculine identity today stresses on a particular set of masculine goals. Now, what sort of particular set of masculine goals are we talking about? We're talking about how in many parts of the world there are men who refer to or who very conveniently talk about a real man being someone who demonstrates power, who demonstrates authority, who demonstrates control over women rather, right? So according to Meshuggah, in many cultures, in many societies, in many parts of the world today, a traditional, typical, hegemonic masculine identity is an identity where men are expected to demonstrate their power, their authority, and the level of control and control over women, while demonstrating indifference. At the same time, additionally, men are expected to demonstrate indifference towards emotions. Men are expected to not be emotional. Men are expected to not show their emotions. I'm sure everyone's heard of how people talk about real men not crying. So, while demonstrating indifference towards emotions, males are encouraged to use violent confrontation and to aggressively pursue their ambition to prove their masculinity. So, in a nutshell, to be able to prove your masculine identity, to be able to prove your hegemonic masculine identity, men in many parts of the world are expected to demonstrate. They're expected to demonstrate power, authority, and control. If we take this a little further, just as we saw a change, just as we saw, just as we discussed a change in terms of how feminine identities are different today as compared to the past. If we take this a little further and talk about a change in masculine identities, if we talk about masculine identities, or as we talk about masculine identities, the question is, have they changed or have they not changed? When we talk about masculine identities, it is important that we understand that there are some sociologists who believe that it is the upbringing process of how, it is how young boys, how males are brought up, the upbringing process. It's the upbringing process to be blamed for when it comes to them being the way they are. So some sociologists believe that the hegemonic way of bringing up boys is leading to two major problems. So we are trying to identify a problem, and the problem is being identified in terms of the upbringing process that males tend to experience. Now, if we talk about uh, the two major problems this has led to a growth in toxic masculinity. Now, when we use the word toxic masculinity refers to harmful societal expectations. Understand this. Toxic masculinity refers to the harmful societal expectations and norms that are associated with traditional masculine roles that perpetuate harm against the individuals and societies. In other words, let me bring in a little more clarity over here. In this context, we talking about how the upbringing process of young boys, how the upbringing process of young boys, or how the gender role socialization that young boys experience tends to be more harmful for themselves than as compared to females. Now, when you talk about toxic masculinity, if you put it in a simple manner, ways in which patriarchy may be harmful to males, how male domination in itself ends up being more harmful for themselves, or for themselves or for males. Now, when I use the word toxic masculinity, an example of this could be how boys from a very young age are told that they're not expected to cry. They're told they are they're made to internalize that they should show indifference towards emotions, which in the longer run might end up in an internal emotional conflict that the child might experience. Yeah, so we were talking about how the hegemonic way of bringing up boys, or how the hegemonic way of the upbringing process or the upbringing gender role socialization affects boys, affects males, and how this has led to two major social problems. The first one over here is toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity has to do with how patriarchy ends up being harmful to males. Or, in other words, how male domination within a society, how the upbringing process of males ends up being more harmful for males. Now, number two, if you talk about the crisis of masculinity, when we refer to the crisis of masculinity, we are referring to how today there's been a decline in the amount of individuals that are been required for the industrial sector. Remember technological advancement. Remember technological advancement. Remember automation. Because of automation, because of technological advancement, because of changes in the economic structure of many countries in the world, today there's been a boom witnessed in the service industry, the tertiary industry, which has consequently led to a lot of male unemployment. And this male unemployment has further led to males experiencing an identity crisis. Now, what sort of identity crisis are we referring to that male have experienced? Males who have been told for many parts in this world, including our own, males from a very young age have been told or are told time and again that they are to end up being, the major role is to be the breadwinner for the family. The major role is to be someone who provides for the family, is to be a provider. So if someone who from a very young age has been told time and again and uh, has been made to internalize that their role is to end up that their role is to earn, that their role is to provide. If they, because of any reason at all, in this case, we've spoken about how this has happened because of a decline in the industrial sector, how this has eventually led to an identity crisis that males have experienced. So, these are the two social problems that we just discussed. Taking this a little further, if we have a look at what Professor Sam Friedman had to say about this, according to this professor, hegemonic masculinity encourages hostile sexism. Now, we have added the word hostile to sexism. Sexism, remember, refers to how you discriminate between males and females on the basis of their sex, on the basis of their gender. And as we use the word hostile sexism over here, we're talking about the hostility that females get to experience by males, right? So, according to Professor Friedman, hegemonic masculinity encourages hostile sexism, or in other words, males are expected or they're allowed to demonstrate hostility it comes to when it comes to discriminating against females. This has further led to misogyny. Misogyny, like I said a couple of minutes earlier, refers to this term. Misogyny refers to the hatred towards females, and how this has further led to dehumanizing women. We spoke about, or we are talking about, male identities changing, the way male identities have changed. Now, as we speak about uh, male identities changing, okay, in between this, there's this contemporary issue is uh, that is about toxic masculinity. I really like this, and I could share this. Share this script with you all, and I would appreciate if you guys could read this. Because of shortage of time, I wouldn't really be able to uh, allow you a lot of time to be able to read this, but you can sure uh, read this later. Now, moving on, while discussing the changes that male identities have experienced, number two, let's talk about an emergence of metrosexuality. We're talking about an emergence of metrosexuality. Now, what does the word metrosexuality over here mean? Now, when we talk about metrosexuality has more to do metrosexuality has more to do with how you experience, how you've witnessed, how you've seen males today being more cautious, them working towards their personal appearance, them being working on their grooming, them having to go through beauty treatments, so on and so forth. Now, if I talk about metrosexuality refers to I'd rather say metrosexuality is a cultural phenomenon, right? A cultural phenomenon where you typically expect urban, right? This is more common in the more developed parts of a country, more developed societies, where you expect a cultural phenomenon, where you expect urban and middle class males to openly show interest in grooming, in fashion, and there are certain lifestyle practices which, of course, challenges the traditional notions that the male identity would carry. In other words, if I put it in a simpler manner, males in many parts of the world, including today, are expected not to be cautious about their grooming, about their emotional expressions, about their fashion consciousness as you compare them with females. I mean, females, it's seen to be a very feminine thing to prioritize your appearance, to prioritize your grooming, to go through any sort of beauty treatment, to be cautious about the fashion sense, your aesthetics, so on and so forth. So today, when we talk about changes in male identity, you could say there's been an emergence of metrosexuality. Now, about metrosexuality over here, in the West, mostly, 21st century has seen an urban heterosexual male who enhances his personal appearance by grooming, beauty treatments, and fashionable clothes. There's a strong overlap. Now, this part, this is what I spoke about, which again, if I may show you an example over here, if you're getting a question of this sort, that has to do this we had this question in May June 2021, and in this question the statement or the quotation over here says male identity is changing. This happens to be a typical 10-mark question, the first part of question number 3, and you're expected as a student to explain this view. When the examiner asks you to explain this view, you are expected to give two relevant points. You're expected to explain two relevant points. Let me just highlight this for you so that, oh, I highlighted something else. Yeah, this point. So you're expected to give two clear and developed points. Yeah, you're expected to give two clear and developed points. Amongst these points, you could write down about one of them could be this one. Traditional notions of hegemonic masculinity are under threat today with the emergence of new masculine identities, right? Then example of this could be metrosexuality, right? Now there are other examples as well which we could discuss later because we're short on time, but this is how we could put to use what we just discussed. Now taking this a little further, if I may pull a line over here so that you know we are starting or stepping into something else. Now, another point that I'd want everyone to understand is an overlap. Today, you see an overlap between the term gender identity and sexual identity. Now, it is pretty important that, like, if you guys remember right at the beginning, I had mentioned right at the beginning, I had mentioned that there's a difference between the term sex and gender. If I say there's a difference in between the term sex and gender, of course there would be a difference in terms of what a gender identity is and how a gender identity is different from an individual's sexual identity. Now, as I use the word gender identity has to do with an individual's internal sense of being a male or a female, right? How you feel about yourself. Do you, as an individual, think you are a male or a female? That has that's gender identity. However, when you talk about when we use the term sexual identity has to do with the sexual orientation that an individual carries. Now, taking this further, if I talk about if I sprinkle a bit of what do you call it, sprinkle a bit of perspectives over here, if we talk about the postmodernist perspective, if I may remind you, we had spoken about the postmodernist perspective earlier in an earlier lesson, where while discussing the approaches or the perspectives on identity, we had spoken about Zygmunt Bauman, right? Zygmunt Bauman, this prominent postmodernist, and his stance, the stance that he carried on social identities. Now, taking this ahead, following on, if we speak about postmodernism, according to the postmodernist perspective, our choices with regard to gender identity have become more numerous in postmodern societies. Or, in other words, today, as we speak in this contemporary era, today, as we speak as a part of a postmodern society, we've seen how many individuals, they have numerous amount of options when it comes to identifying yourself with one gender or another. Now this change again is more prominent in the in the developed parts of the world, and in our part of the world it is considered to be culturally, morally, ethically, and religiously, we're not allowed to, right? I repeat, culturally, morally, ethically, religiously, it doesn't really work for our part of the world. So we're talking about postmodernism, which and in this paragraph over here, this has more to do with an acceptance that the Western world has started showing, an acceptance that the Western world has started showing towards different genders. There have been many countries where homosexual behavior has been decriminalized. For example, in India, it is no more a criminal offense, and so on and so forth. And there's been, let's take this a little further, and if we talk about what constitutes a man or a woman. In recent, that is 20 years, some individuals have reported a mismatch. That is, some even seek surgery between the sex they have been assigned by biology and the personal sense of gender identity. This has led to the emergence of a third type of identity in both the US and Europe that is known as transgender identity. Now, here you go. Now, I'd want you all to be familiar with these terms. This would add on to your sociological knowledge, which you could always put to use while writing answers. Now, when we use the term transgender identity is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity, that is gender expression or behavior, does not conform to that typically associated with the sex to which they're assigned at birth. Now, for instance, if an individual was born as a male, as they grow older, if they do not feel enough of a male, I mean, this is relating to that. Number two, if we're talking about the term, or if we're using the term transsexual is a person who emotionally and psychologically feels that they belong to the opposite sex. Many of you would be familiar with these terms. For the ones who not, you might as well give this a read. So today there's been an acceptance of transsexual identity more so in the western part of the world. This has led to a debate about the meaning of gender and whether gender identity is fixed into two distinct categories or not. This has led some sociologists to conclude that the gender identity is a changeable, or you could say a fluid concept. Gender identity is a fluid concept. Now, taking this a little further, moving on, if we speak about a couple of examples over here, examples of this changeable concept of gender identity. Transgenders today have seen to be receiving a lot of recognition in another gender category in many parts of the world, including India, Pakistan, and Germany. In other words, transgenders today are being recognized in many parts of the world, and these are just a few examples. Number two, when we talk about fluid, or rather say when we talk about flexibility in terms of gender roles, there's this example which you could of course use in your examination as sociological material too. So there are flexible gender roles today shown by, now this is an example of sworn virgins in Albania, and I'd like to show you all a video on this, a tiny little video that would help you understand this better.
Zemrën shpirt e ndjej veten sikur një burr. O burr, se me knosh, unë e kam zgjedh këtë jetë me kokët shpirtit. Unë e kam jetën e përditshme, po në zemrën, në shpirt, e ndjej veten sikur një burr. O burr, se me knosh, unë e kam zgjedh këtë jetë me kokët shpirtit e do ta jetoj deri në pikë të fundit.
Now, I hope through this video, you all have a better understanding of these sworn virgins of Albania. Now, many individuals also are part of the category of intersex identity. What is intersex identity? This is when individuals with such biological characteristics that are neither recognized as male or females. That's pretty self-explanatory. Number two, moreover, there's been an increasing number of people classifying themselves as non-binary. where they don't fit into any one gender category and prefer to be referred to as they or them. Now, these terms like non-binary, like intersex identity, like flexible or fluid gender identities, these terms, I would really, really appreciate if you guys could go through all of these terms through the key terms. There's this amazing collection of key terms as under the heading of glossary in your student book published by Collins that would just enhance your understanding. And many of the words that you'd come across, you'd already be aware of. But if you, let's just say, periodically once in a week maybe go through all of those terms, there are better chances you hold when it comes to you being able to recall them and put them to use when you're answering questions while sitting for your CAIEs. Now, if we have a look at a couple of questions that we've had on this topic earlier, so we had a question in March 2021, and the question over here is a 26 mark evaluative essay question where you're expected to evaluate a particular view, and that view over here is that gender identity is changing. You could, I mean, for the support part, you would be expected to write down how these gender identities are changing and how these gender identities are not changing. There are a couple of references that could possibly be put to use. You did study about Sharp, Connell, and Wilkinson in today's lesson. And in the against part, you could write down about Carnel, Oakley, and Mott. Of course, I mean, there are evidences that you could come across, that you'd come across from Carnel, supporting both sides of the argument. Now, these are terms, there are terms, there are certain, some key concepts that could again be put to use, like assertive femininity, new man, metrosexual, the Ladats, gender fluidity, and gender quake. On the other hand, for the against side of the argument, for the counter thesis, for a counter argument, you guys could write down about patriarchy, determinism, social control, normative or passive femininity, hegemonic or marginalized masculinity, the difference between them. Now, bear this thing in mind. This is pretty important, and this is again published by the Cambridge. This says the above content is indicative, right? When they use the word indicative, what they mean over here, if I may explain this to you, what they're trying to say is, I mean, you could use this, but if you choose not to use any of these and you bring up something of your own that has of course sociological, that's of course sociological material, and something not merely based on common sense, you would be rewarded rewarded appropriately, or you would be rewarded for that. Let me repeat, let me reiterate, this is indicative content. Now, for a sociology student, it has to do with the book or the content, I mean the resource that you're using for your preparation. There are numerous books we have. Amongst these, the two most common ones, the course book that has been published by Cambridge and the student book, which is also referred to as the purple book, that has been published by Collins. They're amazing when it comes to, I mean, regardless of the book you're using, you could use any of the books. And and what this means over here is that these are just some concepts that the examiner is hinting that you possibly could use. But if you choose to use anything besides that besides these, they're totally acceptable, right? As long as they're sociological. So the another thing, reference to sociological theories could also be used and you would be rewarded for them. But then it is important for you to know and understand that you do not have to do them even if you want to score full marks. Remember, I had mentioned this earlier, from since a couple of years, the examiner or the CAIE does not give you direct questions on perspectives in paper one, right? In paper one. So in paper one, you'd never come across a question that would directly expect a lot of knowledge on functionalism, feminism, and postmodernism. Yes, we've had a 4-marker question once that has asked you to describe two forms of femininity, but that's okay, right? That's you're not expected a lot in paper one when it comes to perspectives, right? So reference to sociological perspectives such as feminism, functionalism, or postmodernism may be present, but they're not necessary even for full marks. So we have another question over here. If we quickly have a look at this, we had a question in May, June 2021. This is a typical 3-mark question. Remember, 3-mark question comes in section A, and in section A, you do not get any choice at all. In section A, the third question gives you a statement or a quotation, and you're expected to, this question is divided into 2 parts, and the first part of the question you're expected to explain that particular view, where you get a question worth 10 marks, and in the B part for that same question you are expected to give one sociological argument against. This is worth 6 marks, right? So again, these questions, question number 3 is amazing when it comes to students learning how to write 26 mark answers, because that's essentially what you're doing for a 26 mark evaluative essay question. And this is just a shorter version to that. In the explanation part, like I mentioned earlier, you're expected to give two very clear, very developed points in support of this statement. So choose any 2 points from here or from anywhere else for which you can provide sociological support. Here, sociological material is required for by you. Sociological material is required for you to score well and to score in the top band, that is level 3, 8 to 10 marks. Whatever you write should be good. Knowledge should provide an amazing understanding to that. Whatever the material is, that is the sociological material you're choosing, should be appropriate, that is, should be in line with that particular question. You should not lose focus while writing, and making the relevance to whatever you're writing is your responsibility as a student, and it isn't for the examiner to be guessing what you've written to be in line with the question. You cannot just write something and then deep down inside feel that you implied this. We require clarity. I mean, not we, the CI requires clarity in terms of writing. And all of this is possible through practice. You cannot expect to write the first answer and to be super amazing at it, but the more you practice, the better you'd keep on getting at it. Now, we've just spoken about gender identities, and gender identities we have uh, we've just spoken about gender identities. While we discussed gender identities, we spoke about the changes that feminine identities have faced, the changes that male identities have faced as well. So you could go through this part as well. You could. Additionally, there's another question that we had in May, June 2023, and the question over here reads: evaluate the view that changes in gender identity have been exaggerated. So you guys could write down in support of it. You're expected to write down in support of it. You're expected to write down against this. Ideally, I'd say write an introduction, the first paragraph, then write down 3 paragraphs in support of this three, or if you want to, if you feel confident enough, you could write down 4 paragraphs in support of the argument. Then you could write down 4 paragraphs against the argument and conclude it in an amazing manner, right? So you could write down 10 paragraphs if required. You could write down 8 paragraphs if you do not feel confident enough. For 8 paragraphs, like I said, the first paragraph would have to do with the introduction, the last one would have to do with the conclusion, and the remaining 6 paragraphs, 3 in support, 3 against. For 10 paragraphs, you could again start with an introduction, the first paragraph and the last being a conclusion, and the eight remaining paragraphs, you could use 4 in support and 4 against the argument. That's on your discretion. That's about that has more to do with the extent to which you have put in efforts and you have prepared before you go sit in the examination hall. Now, a frequently asked question over here is, sir, what if we're not able to write down equal amount of paragraphs? That's totally okay. No one's going to eat you up here. The quality of what you write matters. To what extent can you stick to the view that has been mentioned right at the beginning in the question? This is what matters a lot, right? So you could very well write down 3 points in support and 4 against, or the other way around as well. Now, likewise, these, because of shortage of time, I cannot explain all of this right now, but remember, all of this, most of this can be answered if you can develop well based on what we learned from the lesson today. Now, additionally, I would want to show you another source that would be super helpful for this particular topic as well. Now, this is more of content you can put to use when it comes to answering any question on gender identities. Over here, you have some key thinkers such as Connell, Lips, Connell again, and then Kitchen. Taking it ahead, we had spoken about male identities. Over here, you see different type of male identities, and many of these male identities over here, they're self-explanatory. You could read through them, the difference between subordinate masculine identity, subversive masculine identity, complicit masculine identity, or marginalized masculine identities. Likewise, if I take this a little further, we could speak about the crisis of masculine identities, which I did explain to you a little before. There are more of masculine identities that could be possibly put to use, like retributive masculinity, like hyper masculinity. Now, remember, you do not need to learn all of them. Yes, had I been a student, I would have prepared super well. But then again, I'm saying this as a teacher, not as a student. So for a student to help you gain a bit of confidence over here. Remember, it isn't as difficult as you think it is to score well in sociology. You just need to carry a smart approach. You need to be disciplined when it comes to preparation. You need to be consistent when it comes to preparation. If you're disciplined, if you're consistent, and if you are guided well, if you're preparing in the right direction, inshallah, there's nothing that's going to hold you back from scoring well. Now, for even, I mean, the maximum amount of uh, marks that you get for a particular question is an evaluative essay question. But remember when I said, for any evaluative essay question, even if you've prepared 3 points in support and 3 point against, according to what you find the easiest may be, I think it's good enough to help you get through, right? So for sociology, subject like sociology, you could go on and on and on. Likewise, there are different type of feminine identities or female identities we have. Like we should know the difference. I mean, it is good if you know the difference between contingent femininity, assertive femininity, and autonomous femininity, right? There are some subcategories over here as well, like normalized feminine identities, like sexualized feminine identities, like girl power identities, like modernized feminine identities, like aging feminine identities. So there's a long list, and you could go on and on and on. I'd probably try explaining all of these concepts, all of these different type of identities to you in another lesson. Because of shortage of time, I cannot take this any further. I hope this has been helpful, and I'd really appreciate if you go through all of the past paper questions that I just showed you as well. Now,